Hello everyone! Today's topic of discussion is Shakespeare Retold, a 4-part miniseries aired by the BBC in 2005, in which 4 different Shakespeare plays were adapted for the modern era with 21st century settings, scenarios, and dialogue. Much Ado About Nothing revolves around a broadcast news team, Macbeth unfolds in the kitchen of a posh restaurant, The Taming of the Shrew is concerned with an ambitious member of Parliament, and A Midsummer Night's Dream takes place at a resort called Dream Park. With the possible exception of the historical plays, although even those can be toyed around with, much of Shakespeare's work lends itself to this kind of interpretation. He himself played a little fast and loose with some details, with locations and time periods. Certain plays have little to tie them to a specific setting, so modernization is relatively easy to pull off, and it's not a novel concept. This kind of thing has been going on for quite some time. Some modernizations retain the early modern English text, like Orson Welles' landmark Mercury Theatre production of Julius Caesar, set in fascist Italy, the 1995 film version of Richard III, also set in the 30s and reimagining the character as a fascist usurper, and Baz Luhrmann's 1996 adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, which paired its contemporary setting and Shakespeare's original language with controversial results. And then there are the modernizations that completely rewrite the original text, such as West Side Story, the musical retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1950s New York City, Akira Kurosawa's 1957 film Throne of Blood, an adaptation of Macbeth set in feudal Japan, or his 1985 film Ran, inspired by King Lear. 1999's 10 Things I Hate About You is based on The Taming of the Shrew, and 2006's She's the Man is a modernization of Twelfth Night. These 4 Shakespeare Retold adaptations fall into this latter category. The storylines and characters belong to William Shakespeare, but just about everything else is rewritten. Now, I'm not a huge fan of modernized adaptations of classic literature, mainly because I am a nerd who loves words. Whether we're talking about Shakespeare, Austen, Bronte, or whoever, a large part of what I love about the work in question is its original, old-fashioned language. The words themselves, the sound of the words together, their significance, why the writer chose those words. So if you present me with a modernized adaptation, especially of a book I love, which removes all that good, wonderful, original dialogue, my gut reaction is, thanks. You took out my favorite part. There's also sometimes the problem where modernizations of old literature tend to require so much manipulation to please the modern audience that the original story becomes almost unrecognizable, at which point I'm inclined to say, just skip it and write your own story. But that's just me. With Shakespeare, however, in general, I'm more open to the idea. I agree that modernization can be done, and done very well. So I try to be more forgiving and more lenient if the changes made result in something a little wonky. We'll find out, though, in this video that I do have a threshold. There is a point where I just feel like, this modernization without Shakespeare's text, it just doesn't work! I was already a little familiar with this miniseries because I had seen one of the films some years ago, and that's the one that my mom and I started with. Actually, it's the reason why I rented this in the first place, so that she could watch The Taming of the Shrew, which aired third. It was adapted by Sally Wainwright and directed by David Richards. Shirley Henderson and Rufus Sewell star in this version of one of Shakespeare's more controversial plays. The Shrew, in this instance, is an MP in the running to become leader of the opposition, but Catherine Minola's bad temper makes her an unpopular candidate, so her advisors recommend she get married to soften her image. When her fashion model sister Bianca flippantly rejects her longtime manager's proposal, saying she'll only get married when Catherine does, the manager turns to his friend Petruchio, whose name I don't believe is actually spoken in the film, a loud, eccentric guy deep in debt after his father's death, looking for someone rich to marry, and he sets his sights on Catherine. What follows is an absurd but very amusing romantic comedy where Petruchio and Kate really do like each other, but their difficult temperaments cause them to rage at each other and fight for dominance. Everything gets very wacky. The performances, the music cues, the costumes. Henderson and Sewell are awfully fun together, embracing the madness and hilarity of their characters. Henderson really lets loose, and her unpredictable, venomous Hellcat is sort of an exaggeration of a character she played in 2001's The Way We Live Now. Sewell, on the other hand, is somehow winsome and relaxed even when he's shouting his head off, and he manages to remain attractive even when acting totally bonkers. There are a few places where they squeeze in a line or two of Shakespeare. Amazingly, these lines don't stick out like a sore thumb, probably because they're spoken by Petruchio, who is theatrical and wild and says a lot of zany things anyway. Between the various accents and the speed with which the dialogue is spoken, especially by Henderson and Sewell, good luck trying to understand all the dialogue with the subtitles off, especially if you aren't familiar with British slang, especially insults and innuendo. It's quite a bit of innuendo in all of these. You might think, oh, it's modernized Shakespeare, so I should be able to understand everything much easier than I would if I was actually reading or watching the original text. Not in this case. I'm not sure I liked the attempt to explain away Petruchio's more offensive behavior as an emotional or psychological weakness. For more sensitive viewers who were disturbed by the way he harangues and humiliates Catherine, I'm not sure that it buys him forgiveness. And anyway, there isn't supposed to be an explanation for it, is there? Petruchio just does these things because he's a big crazy man. Because of its controversial nature, a man physically and psychologically tormenting a bad-tempered woman until she fits the mold of the perfect, obedient wife, I'm honestly surprised they took it on in the first place. People have long argued over the misogyny of the play. This adaptation doesn't necessarily try to resolve that debate. It is a valiant effort to make the story work in a modern and professional setting. I'm not sure it always does work, but it's an interesting take, especially with how the ending is handled. The way it's acted does allow for a little wiggle room. There are a few different ways you could interpret just where the couple stands with each other on a certain point, but there's no doubt that they're happy together. The second one we watched was the second episode, Macbeth. I'd always kind of wanted to see this one, partly because it's Macbeth, and partly because it has Richard Armitage in it. This take on the Scottish play was adapted by Peter Moffat and directed by Mark Brozell. It stars James McAvoy and Keeley Hawes and is set in the high-stress environment of a classy restaurant's kitchen. Joe Macbeth is head chef working for Duncan, the celebrity chef who owns the restaurant but seldom steps into the kitchen, yet is more than happy to take credit for Macbeth's achievement. After hearing a prophecy from 3 weird bin men, Macbeth and his wife take matters into their own hands to ensure Macbeth takes over. The restaurant analogy is interesting, certainly different, and to a certain degree, it works surprisingly well. But not always. The intensity of the action and the extreme lengths people go to don't seem as believable to me in this setting as they do when you're dealing with the kingship of Scotland. Sometimes the translation worked, sometimes it didn't. I was certainly engaged through the whole thing, keeping track of the changes, which was tough to do sometimes while contending with thick accents and mumbled dialogue. I thought I was good at understanding different British dialects, but these first 2 films were a challenge. I also suspect they struggled to squeeze everything into the 90-minute time frame, resulting in a final third that felt a little clumsy and rushed. But the thing that bugged me the most, and I know how unfair this is, was the absence of Shakespeare's text. I really missed it. Going into this, I I think I assumed that there'd be quite a bit of the original material woven in. Macbeth is loaded with famous lines and speeches, and it just... I thought... Well, I thought it would be different than it was. As it is, they didn't include much of it, and I really felt the loss. The actors play their parts well and convincingly speak what has been written, but it just can't compare. When pigs fly and when a pig lands on your head just doesn't have the same ring as when Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane and no man of woman born. The most disappointing example for me was when Macbeth is informed, spoiler, of his wife's suicide. The guy who brings him the news apologizes, and Macbeth gives him this quick, testy response. What do you have to be sorry for? She was my wife, wasn't she? And then he says something like, you know what I feel about her death? I feel nothing. And that's it. You should have seen me when we were watching this, and this scene played out, and I was like, is that it? That's all you're gonna say? I feel nothing? What? It is such a far cry from the scene in the original play, which is one of the most famous soliloquies Shakespeare ever wrote. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The whole thing is Macbeth realizing and expressing how empty and meaningless this whole thing has become for him. And he lands on that last word, nothing, as like the final and it's supposed to be heavy and deep. But the statement here, just a blunt, bald, I feel nothing, is devoid of subtlety. The complexity is gone. Nothing about this moment challenges you to think beyond the words and the moment itself. I also felt like the script tried a little too hard to paint the Macbeths in a sympathetic light. Between Lady Macbeth's long-suppressed grief catching up with her and Duncan being shown as supremely unlikable, it felt manipulative, rather than letting the story speak for itself and the audience decide for itself. I also didn't care for the final showdown, which becomes a quick knife fight in the kitchen. It was awkward, for one thing, and for another, I felt it changed the character of Macduff, who I've always liked. Spoiler! His violent stabbing of Macbeth plays a lot differently in this cold, lonely setting than on a battlefield, and in my opinion, the act turned the noble Macduff into someone vengeful and bloodthirsty, not all that different from the Macbeths. Maybe that was the point, but I didn't like it. So I was pretty disappointed with this one, although it has clever visuals and sincere performances. I can't complain that it was bleak and bloody because that's to be expected. It's Macbeth. I guess I'm just not as enamored of the story when you strip it of its original language. The one we watched third is actually the one that aired first, Much Ado About Nothing, adapted by David Nichols and directed by Brian Percival, starring Damian Lewis and Sarah Parish. This adaptation of one of Shakespeare's wittiest comedies unfolds at a broadcast network where Beatrice and Benedict are co-anchors of an evening news program who hate each other's guts. Instead of it being just one of those things, there's an explanation provided. 3 years ago, arrogant hotshot Benedict stood sharp-tongued Beatrice up for a date. What a breath of fresh air this was! This one is very funny, especially thanks to its leads. Damian Lewis is not known for being a comic actor, but he's really good here. His facial expressions, his delivery, his comic timing. He also speaks in his native English accent, so this is kind of two rarities in one. Speaking of accents, the dialogue is nice and clear in this one, very easy to understand. The stars are well matched, and the characters' interactions when they're verbally sparring snap with clever wit. But the transition from enemies who loathe each other to very confused lovers is smooth as well. It's absurd and far-fetched because you can't just flip a switch like that, but they sell it. Benedict in particular proving himself to be as sincerely warm and compassionate in the second half as he was obnoxious and self-absorbed in the first half. Part of the appeal comes from the likability of all the characters, minus the one creepy guy who turns out to be the villain, and the simplicity of the story, which follows the original pretty closely. There's also more Shakespeare in this one, though not necessarily from Much Ado About Nothing. There's an entire scene devoted to Sonnet 116, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds Admit Impediments. The other couple, Hero and Claude, played by Billy Piper and Tom Ellis, isn't as exciting to watch, but the characters are well developed and there's good build-up to the conflict, which, when it does erupt, drastically switches the play's gears from comedy to tragedy. There is realism and universality in this situation and with these characters that helps it work in a modern setting very well. And while there are deviations from the play, there's no harm done. And in fact, I preferred one major change where Claude isn't let off easy. It does get rather dark for a while, but it ends on a charming high note, and my mom and I agreed without hesitation that this one, Much Ado About Nothing, is the best of the bunch. The fourth and final episode is A Midsummer Night's Dream, adapted by Peter Boker and directed by Ed Freeman. I had the least amount of interest in this one, not being a big fan of the original play, but I was curious how they'd make it work in a modern setting, since the story is mired in fantasy. Orientation took a couple scenes, but I think they did a decent job with the retelling. It doesn't take out the fantasy or provide an alternative explanation. It just rolls with the idea that, yep, there's a fairy king and queen who interfere in people's love lives and keep tabs on them. It's a pretty straightforward adaptation. The action is set entirely within this so-called dream park, a wooded resort where a group is supposed to be celebrating an engagement until the daughter, to her father's dismay, suddenly breaks up with her fiancé and goes off with another guy. It's not a remarkable comedy, it's not hilarious, it didn't induce any belly laughs, but it does a fair job with tricky material. I find the plot of A Midsummer Night's Dream pretty ridiculous, so from the get-go it faces an uphill battle with me, but it takes advantage of the absurdity. Puck acts as the go-between, introducing the audience to what's going on and then including us all along the way with knowing glances and cheeky asides. He was likable, he established a strong connection with the viewer, and it helped a lot having someone to latch onto. It made it easier to juggle the different characters and maintain interest as the story jumps from one couple to another. There's a good mix of lesser-known actors and veterans here. Lennie James and Sharon Small play Oberon and Titania, and Bill Paterson and Imelda Staunton play the parents, older married couple Theo and Polly, who are derived from Theseus and Hippolyta. What's done with them is probably the adaptation's biggest diversion from the source material, yet it may be its most compelling storyline. At one point, Staunton's Polly runs out of patience with her husband and delivers this fiery speech, which was excellent. I wanted to stand up and cheer. A Midsummer Night's Dream wasn't great, I didn't get super into it, but I liked it well enough. It has a certain degree of charm, and it also has probably the most even balance of Shakespeare and contemporary language. Occasionally, the fairies divert into speaking early modern English. They drop quite a bit of Shakespeare, and I think it makes sense for them to be the ones who speak it. It makes about as much sense as any modern retelling of A Midsummer Night's Dream can. For the most part, I enjoyed this collection of rom-coms, loosely based on the plays of William Shakespeare. Well, Macbeth is not a rom-com, but I also didn't really enjoy it. But all four of them are very creative interpretations. They are competently made, they're well acted. Many of the performers are familiar faces, including some people who are much more famous now. As for what my mom thought, she's not into Shakespeare, so she didn't care much for that angle. She was not invested in that element of it, but I think that her reactions aligned with mine more or less. Much Ado About Nothing was the best. The Taming of the Shrew was crazy. I was not surprised by it because I had seen it before. Part of the fun of watching it was seeing her reactions, but I think that her main takeaway was, wow, that was wild. And Macbeth was interesting, but kind of a drag. She didn't have the strong feelings that I did because she really doesn't care about Macbeth. And A Midsummer Night's Dream, she nodded off on, so she doesn't really have a verdict on that. She didn't mean to nod off. It wasn't because she wasn't liking it. It just happened, as it does. As it does to me more often than I will admit to. But I was wide awake for all four of these. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have seen one or some or all of these adaptations, I'd love to hear what you thought in the comments below. And stay tuned. I believe the next video will cover what else I saw in March, and I may post that a day or two or three later than usual. The first of the month is Saturday, and I can't get it cranked out that quickly, but I will get it to you as soon as I possibly can. Thanks for watching.